to take a picture from Craig's preaching. He does it so well. I'm going to attempt. I have pages and pages of sermon notes. I'm not going to throw them away. I can't do that quite yet. But this week, I have decided to take a passage out of Job. And how many of you know the story of Job? What more can you hear about the story of Job? There's plenty in there, but we tend to think of Job and his wealth, and then Satan takes it away, and then he questions God, and then he finds out that he gets his answers, and then he gets re-blessed with all that was taken away. Well, that's true. That is the story of Job. However, I want to do some information that you may not know, and then pick out a few small verses to talk about. Job lived in the land of Uz, U-Z. Now, the land of Uz is in the eastern part of Arabia, and that at that time, it was not a good place to live. A lot of pagan worship, a lot of throwing of parties, decadence, just a terrible place to live. Just to give you a modern day perspective, it would be sort of like living in the center of Chicago. Okay? What's it like in Chicago? Anybody know? This is a participation.
It's a mess.
It's a mess. You're right. What's going on in the center of Chicago? Murders, robberies, rape.
Sin.
Okay. Oh, I love that. Just plain sin. We don't need to break it down. And I chose Chicago, but I could have chosen any big city here in the United States. Now imagine living amongst that day after day after day. Now, I'm one of those people that, I don't know, it's not a good characteristic, but I'm going to tell it on myself anyway. I look at others sometimes and can become easily influenced by them. So I would not be a good candidate to live in Chicago, all right? We tend to sometimes be followers, and it would have been so easy for Job to follow the people around him. Imagine day after day after day after day. Let me just give you another example. I love ice cream. Okay? Some of you do too. All right. Now think about this. Dave goes to the freezer and gets out ice cream. Okay, ice cream in itself isn't bad. But then he goes, sweetie, would you like some? It is so hard to say, no, thank you. Do I ever say no, thank you? Not often. But just think about this. You know, when this temptation is around and around and around, it is easy to succumb to that. Job could have, but he chose not to. So I want to read just verses 1 through 5 in chapter 1. In the land of Uz, there lived a man whose name was Job. This man was blameless and upright. He feared God and shunned evil. He had 7 sons and 3 daughters, and he owned 7,000 sheep, 3,000 camels, 500 yoke of oxen, 500 donkeys, and a large number of servants. He was the greatest man among all the people of the East. His sons used to take turns holding feasts in their homes, and they would invite their 3 sisters to eat and drink with them. When a period of feasting had run its course, Job would send and have them purified. Early in the morning, he would sacrifice a burnt offering for each of them, thinking, perhaps my children have sinned and cursed God in their hearts. This was Job's regular custom. So I want to pick apart those few verses. Now, here's my question. How many verses are in the book of Job? Don't add up on your fingers. I counted, or I didn't count. I asked Siri, and there are 1,027 verses in the book of Job. So if you go home today and you start counting the verses, if I'm wrong, don't blame me, blame Siri, because that's where I got my information. But I remember we were talking about Chicago. Job didn't look around his circumstances. He was looking up, not around. And how many times when things are difficult or hard or frustrating, we're looking at what is around us instead of looking up at God. We need to do more of that. And after I'm thinking about Job living in Chicago, I'm just going to use that. Remember how God actually pointed out to Satan, look at my servant Job? It's like, Lord, please don't do that to me. But Job overcame living where he did, and he truly was righteous. And for God to say, here he is, you've got him, you can test him, is a huge compliment. Now, here's the part that gets frustrating to me. Job is righteous. His friends see his righteousness. His wife see his righteousness. And yet, when Satan took everything away from him, in that day and time, they believed when calamity came upon you, it was because there must be sin in your life somewhere. Now think about this. Job lost all of his children. He lost all of his animals. He lost his health, his wealth. If we go by the assumption that there must have been sin in his life, after losing all that, there must have been a lot of sin in his life. But we know that's not true. Yet his friends, his close friends, kept saying, you must have sinned. There must be some hidden sin in there somewhere, Job. And they said, curse God and die. And Job kept saying, there's no sin in my life. I haven't, And they wouldn't believe him. Now, how would you like to have friends like that don't even believe you? Right?
You don't need enemies.
Yeah, you don't. Those are your enemies. Your friends are your enemies. You're absolutely right. But I love the next part. Job's wife even said to him, curse God and die. The woman who lives with him, who watches him daily. Men, how would you like a supportive wife like that? Dave, don't answer that question. Okay? All right? So, even his friends in his life don't even believe that he lived a righteous life. But I'm going to take a look at verses 4 and 5. I'm going to talk about them specifically. It says, his sons used to take turns holding feasts in their homes, and they would invite their 3 sisters to eat and drink with them. When a period of feasting had run its course, Job would send and have them purified. Early in the morning, he would sacrifice a burnt offering for each of them, thinking, perhaps my children have sinned and cursed God in their hearts. This was Job's regular custom. Now I want to talk about stuff that happens even before all the bad stuff happens, which we usually associate the book of Job with the bad stuff. I want to talk about his righteousness. And what does that mean? Well, Job had 10 children. And I don't know about back in those days, but in this day and age, you have to be pretty wealthy to have 10 children and raise them. That was a sign of his wealth, all right? Lord, please don't bless me with that kind of wealth. All right, I'll take the money. But, so, I just, 10 children, no. But, his sons used to take turns holding feasts. Now, what do you think of when I say the word feast? A lot of eating, okay? That's it? Conversation, what?
Party hardy.
Party hardy, yeah. And in those days, the feasts weren't just a couple of hours. They could last days, all right? And so the sons would take turns having feasts. However, there's a little caveat in there. It says they would invite their 3 sisters to eat and drink with them. Now, back in those days, women were, I don't want to say put on a pedestal, but treated differently than they are now. Okay? And so when those sisters came, some of the hardy party stuff was ramped down because gentle women didn't have that kind of influence on them. And I thought, that was really nice of those brothers. Okay? Also, to have those kinds of feasts, they had to have money. So Job must have been very proud of his sons. They were grown, they were on their own. They also had money to be able to throw those feasts. Job doesn't tell us whether he had grandchildren, but if he did, in my opinion, grandchildren are a great sign of wealth. They are just so precious. But it meant that they could afford things. And Job took his role of patriarch very seriously. Someone once told me, I have a dear friend, and she is very opinionated. Let's just do this. Please don't put this on the internet because she'll know who I'm talking about, okay? But she said it is a parent's job. Every parent should raise their children to grow up to become productive members of society. That is our one job. Productive members of society. And also to believe in God. And that's what Job did. He raised his children to be productive members of society. Job went that second step, though. He also made sure that his children knew God because he wanted them to live righteous lives as well. So, parents' job when their children get adults, don't ask my children if I do this, okay? But our job is to have a supporting role. And so many times, I wanted to say to one of our sons, do you remember that I taught you this and this? Or I want to say, son, that really isn't a wise decision. Even though you're 47 years old, that's not really a wise decision. But I'm learning, that's not my job. My job is to support him, and if he figures out that that wasn't a wise decision that I already knew, to say, not, I told you so, but okay, pick yourself up, dust yourself off, figure out where you went wrong, and make it right. That is so hard sometimes. I don't know, Dave, do you have that problem? Or is it just a female problem?
No comment.
But yes, so Job had to step back and let his sons and daughters make decisions on their own. That's a parent's job. Now, remember we talked about those 3 sisters coming, right? It also, nowhere in my Bible does it say that at these feasts there was family problems. I don't know about you, but when my family has a get-together, we have some people sitting over here who won't speak to the people who are sitting over here. And then as the person in the middle, it's like, okay, don't let them say anything too loud to upset these people, because then these people are going to be over there and it's not going to be a good thing. Some of you are going, yep, we have the same problems in our family. Well, in Job's family, it appears that there was harmony. The brothers kept the feasts, not too raucous, but again, we had to somewhat, I don't want to say live to standards of the time, but we also wanted to be known as the people who gave good parties, right? I give horrible parties. So if I ever invite you, if you want a good time, don't come to my parties. But anyway, what I'm saying is the feasts were fun, they weren't dull, and they were well attended, but not so over the top that women couldn't be there. So again, the sons were raised to respect their sisters, to respect the other people that are there. Again, Job took his role as patriarch very seriously. He taught his sons and daughters respect for themselves, for adults, for siblings, for little kids. There may have been little kids at those feasts. I don't think so, but there may have been. We need to teach our children, young people, to show respect. And I'm not saying that we need to go back to the times of yes ma'am, yes sir, but I do love hearing those words from little kids in preschool. Yes ma'am, no ma'am. Okay, I don't like no ma'am, but yes ma'am, always agreeing with me. But that, I think, is a lost art in our society today. And I went to my handy dandy thesaurus on my computer. I wanted to look up some synonyms for respect, because it's like, okay, what are other words I could use? Admiration, esteem, I like this one, reverence, veneration, consideration, high regard. Are those words used in today's society much? Not too much. We need to reinstill them. And just because my sons are grown, oh, my grandkids get lectures. My preschoolers get lectures on how to treat others well. We have a whole lesson on how to treat your friends. And some of those words seem like they'd be very hard to follow, but God deserves our respect, our admiration, our reverence, our deference. How many times do we do what we want to do instead of what God tells us to do? Right? But they seem like high standards, but with God's help, we can live up to them. All right? Now, the Bible doesn't say whether the sons invited Job to their parties. But Job never went to the parties. I don't know why, but think about this. How many of you would like to go to parties that your children are throwing? I'm too old. Just too old, you know? So maybe that's how Job felt. But he doesn't seem like he went. And I'm sure they invited him because they loved him, but I don't think he went. But he knew what went on at those parties, those feasts. How did he know? Because I'm sure when he was younger, he gave the same kinds of feasts. Also, word gets back to parents. It always does. But he was concerned about their spiritual welfare, not just their material welfare, but their spiritual. So it says in here that he would give sacrifices because he was afraid his children may have done something that was sinful during those parties. So he daily gave sacrifices to help cleanse them. He prayed for them daily. I'm sure he counseled them. So he wasn't just concerned about making sure they were had everything they need physically, but he was more concerned about spiritually. And he made them, I should say, he invited them to attend those sacrifices. Why? That's a question. Why? Because he wanted them to realize what it takes to live a holy life. Why do we bring our children to church? To expose them to God. Why do we have them go to Sunday school? Why do we still make sure my grown sons and their families go to church? To remind them of what God expects. He wanted them to also participate in those. He initiated them, but he wanted them to participate in them. So he prayed for them daily. And I think sometimes we need to follow in Job's footsteps. We may have grown children, but we still love them no matter what they do. And Job still loved his children. But we need to allow them to live their own lives. But I think now we need to pray for them even more. And help them and guide them. So that they too can live holy lives. That was one of my goals. People will say, oh, you're a pastor, your kids are automatically going to stay in the church. Do you know how many pastors' children drop out of the church when they grow up? I don't know the exact statistics, but I would say at least 50%. So don't assume that a pastor's child is automatically going to keep the faith. And I am so thankful that both of our sons have kept the faith. Okay? But there is so much wisdom in this book. So many little things we could pick out. It's not only a book about what happens to Job, but it's how Job responded to all of that. Remember, what did his friends say? What did his friends tell him to do? Curse God and die, right? His wife told him that. But he chose not to. He questioned God, but in the end, he trusted God, and he was rewarded for that trust. God restored everything to him. Gave him 10 more children. Lord, don't do that, okay? But he gave him 10 more children. And did Job? He probably raised those 10 the same way he did the first 10, because he was a righteous man. And just like Craig said with his friend, how the woman said, you show God to me. We want to show God to the world and reflect our righteousness, not a bragging righteousness, but our righteousness in trusting God, living for him, respecting him, and then going out and showing him to the world. Thank you. Are we going to have a closing hymn? Is it going to be one that still reflects the joy or the progression of the service? I don't want to put pressure on you at all.